Libby, Montana. Winter of 1912. The sky hung heavy in a dull gray, snowflakes falling sparsely, dusting the crooked wooden rooftops. Smoke curled thinly from chimneys, swaying in the wind like fraying ribbons. The streets were scarred with deep, muddy ruts, frozen rocks jutting out here and there. Then came a long, sharp whistle, a train's cry slicing through the hush of the little town. The train screeched to a halt at the modest platform, iron wheels grinding, steam hissing. At the last car's door she appeared, Sarah Lynn Carpenter. She stepped down carefully, one worn leather suitcase in hand, gloved fingers gripping its handle tight. Her simple moss-green wool dress hugged her tall frame, making her stand out instantly among the rough-hewn loggers gathered outside the saloon across the street. She stood nearly 6 feet tall, and in all her years in Boston, she had learned that such a height was no blessing. She drew a long breath, letting the icy air cut into her lungs. Her face was hard set in the fading afternoon light, but her eyes held a quiet defiance, the kind that either earned respect or drew sneers. But she hadn't come to Montana to lower her head. In the pocket of her coat, the now creased letter still promised her a home, a man, and a new life. For 6 months, she and Robert Kinney, the lumber mill owner, had exchanged letters faithfully. About potato soup, timber shipments, the books he read. He had never once asked how tall she was. She had never once said, and that had felt safe enough. The train let out one last piercing whistle and rolled away, leaving Sarah standing still, her shadow stretching long on the muddy platform. No one waited for her. No one called her name. Not a single hand raised. She gripped her suitcase harder, her shoes already caked with heavy mud, and began to walk. Down Libby's main street, past swaying shop signs and rough stairs. The men outside the saloon followed her with their eyes, some even letting out slow whistles and curling smirks. But she didn't stop. She had lived her whole life being looked at that way, and yet she had never broken. As the fading light sank behind the jagged mountains, she reached the edge of town, where the pine forest loomed dark and still. She sat on a snow-dusted fallen log, letting her suitcase drop beside her, letting the cold seep through her thin wool coat. Her hands clenched tight, her eyes shut, and she listened to the wind slicing through the trees. And somewhere deep in her chest, the ache of loneliness pricked like a needle. And then, from behind her, a deep, steady voice cut through the quiet. "Quite a view from up here, isn't it?" Sarah turned, startled, but still composed. A few steps away stood a tall man, broad-shouldered, his sleeves rolled up, a thick beard framing a steady face, his blue eyes catching the last light of dusk. He stood with his arms loosely crossed, leaning against a pine, his breath rising in faint white clouds in the cold air. "Sorry if I startled you," he said, his voice low and calm, with no hint of awkwardness. "Ethan Blackwood. I run the Northern Logging Camp." Sarah didn't answer right away. She glanced back toward the muddy road that led into town, where faint yellow lights had begun to glow in the windows. No one else approached. Only dark silhouettes lingered near the saloon, still watching her. Ethan took a step closer, his eyes briefly on her worn suitcase, then back to her face. "There's a decent boarding house in town," he went on. "Run by Mabel Webb. Warm beds, hot meals, doors that lock. I can take you there." Sarah's grip on her suitcase tightened, her voice calm but faintly trembling. "Why would you want to help me?" Ethan gave a slow, almost imperceptible smile. Not quite a grin, more like a quiet understanding. "Because nobody deserves to be left standing alone in a place like this," he replied. "And because folks who don't fit the mold are usually the ones who change everything." Sarah looked at him for a long moment. There was no pity in his eyes. She stood, brushed snow off her skirt, and nodded. "All right, I'll go with you." Ethan offered his hand, but she only tightened her hold on the suitcase and followed. He didn't mind. He simply turned and walked ahead, his boots sinking into the mud with slow, deliberate steps. Sarah followed close behind, hearing her own heart pound, hearing the wind whip through the pines, hearing faint laughter carry from the saloon. But somehow, walking beside him, Those stairs no longer felt so sharp, no longer cut so deep. Libby's main street glimmered in small, fragile, golden lights. Along the way, men stepped out of doorways to watch them pass. Women gathering up shop displays glanced over their shoulders, their expressions hard to read, part curiosity, part caution. At the end of the street, they stopped before a modest two-story house, its white painted wood siding weathered by years of wind and snow. A warm light glowed through its windows, the faint scent of bread and stew drifting out into the cold. A sign swung above the door, Webb's boarding house. Ethan climbed the steps and knocked. Before long, a stout woman with pink cheeks and hair pinned up neatly opened the door. Her sharp eyes swept quickly from Ethan to Sarah, then softened. "Mr. Blackwood," she said with a faint smile. "About time you showed up." Ethan tipped his head. "I've brought you a guest. She needs a place to stay tonight." Mrs. Webb studied Sarah, her height, her mud-streaked boots, her worn suitcase, then gave a single, firm nod and stepped aside. "Come in, dear. No need to freeze out there." Sarah stepped over the threshold. At once, the warmth of the house wrapped around her. The kitchen smelled faintly of meat stew and bread, framed paintings hung on the walls, and the fireplace crackled softly. She set her suitcase down and heard Mrs. Webb go on. "Rooms at the end of the upstairs hall. Sheets are clean. If you want to wash up, baths at the end of the row. Breakfast at 7. Sarah nodded slightly. "Thank you." Mrs. Webb gave her a knowing smile. Not everyone comes to Libby alone, but those who do usually aren't the fragile sort. Ethan stood at the door, slowly removing his hat. His eyes lingered on Sarah for an extra beat before he nodded. "Good night, Miss Carpenter. Good luck to you." Sarah looked at him and replied softly, "Thank you. And thank you for not turning away." He only gave a faint, quiet smile, then stepped down from the porch, his tall frame fading into the light snow and gathering darkness, his shadow stretching long over the empty street. She stood for a moment, watching him disappear, then finally turned, picked up her suitcase, and climbed the creaking stairs. The boards groaned under her weight, their sound loud in the stillness of the house. She opened the door to her room, sat on the edge of the bed, her hands resting on her suitcase, and at last let out a long breath. She didn't yet know what tomorrow would bring. She only knew that tonight, for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel entirely alone. The next morning, Libby woke under a thin white quilt of snow, soft and pristine on rooftops, streets, and the tall pines beyond town. Pale morning sunlight seeped through thick clouds, bathing the little logging town in a silvery chill. Sarah awoke to the faint scent of bacon and fresh bread wafting up from the kitchen below. The small room Mrs. Webb had given her was simple but clean. White lace curtains at the window, a faded embroidery of Montana's mountains and rivers on the wall. She sat up, swung her feet onto the cold wooden floor, and drew in a deep breath. She stood before the mirror. Staring back at her was a tall woman, dark brown hair pulled back neatly, amber eyes clear and unflinching. Not the defeated look of the night before, but something else now, faint, fragile, resolve. Mrs. Webb met her downstairs, a large cast-iron skillet in hand and a warm smile on her face. "Sleep well, Miss Carpenter." Sarah gave a slight nod, her voice steady but quiet. "Better than I thought I would." Mrs. Webb chuckled softly. "Nobody here's going to make you stoop, dear. My late husband was nearly 6.5 feet himself. Had every doorway in this place raised when we built it. Said he was tired of living like a hunchback." Sarah couldn't help it. The faintest smile curved her lips. For the first time since leaving Boston, her shoulders felt just a little lighter. Breakfast was simple but satisfying. Fried eggs, dark bread, crisp bacon, and strong, black coffee. When Sarah set down her empty cup, Mrs. Webb dried her hands on her apron and looked at her. "So, what's your plan?" Sarah glanced down at her calloused hands. "I plan to stay. At least for now, I sew. Coats, dresses, even men's work pants. I can support myself." Mrs. Webb didn't miss a beat. "Good. There's a little room out back. Used to be my sewing room. Bright light, good table, thread rack's still there. You go ahead and set yourself up. You won't be a bother here. And anyway, my winter coat's coming apart at the seams." Sarah blinked, as though she hadn't quite believed her own ears. "I don't want to impose." "Don't be silly," Mrs. Webb waved her off, bustling from the kitchen. "You're not imposing on anyone. Besides, you'll likely do better work than I ever did." By midday, the little back room had been transformed into a tidy sewing shop. Sarah laid out bolts of wool, cotton, and scraps of calico she'd brought from Boston, arranged her needles, thread, and measuring tape in neat rows. Winter sunlight slanted through the window, pale but clean. Before 2 hours had passed, the first knock came. An older woman stood there, clutching a faded cotton dress, smiling sheepishly. "Your eyes are still good, your hands still steady," she murmured. "Mine aren't anymore. I'd be much obliged." Then came a second customer, and a third. Sarah bent her head and stitched, line by line. And though she could still hear the faint laughter from the saloon down the street, it no longer cut her quite the same way it had the night before. That afternoon, as she was tidying up a stack of wool, a familiar shadow filled the doorway. She looked up, and met those steady blue eyes. Ethan Blackwood stood there, hat in hand, the faintest wry smile on his sun-tanned face. "Miss Carpenter," he said, his voice slow and deliberate. "I thought you'd have gone." "Not yet," she replied, standing straighter. "Good," he said. Then, after a brief pause, "I've got a proposition. My boys tear through their clothes like wildcats. Nobody up at camp can sew a straight line. I'd like to hire you." Sarah stiffened slightly. "You want to hire me?" "Not hire," he corrected, meeting her eyes firmly. "Fair trade. You have skill. I have need. No charity, no pity." For the first time, she smiled. A real, quiet smile. "All right, we have a deal." Ethan gave a short nod. Before he turned to leave, he hesitated, voice dropping lower. "Saturday night there's a social at the church. Mrs. Webb will probably drag you along. People gather, eat, place their orders for winter. Good chance to meet folks." Sarah tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Will you be there?" "Usually I don't," he replied, the faintest smirk tugging at one corner of his mouth. "But this time, maybe I will." He tipped his hat, then stepped back into the fading light. That tall, solid figure disappeared once more among the pines, leaving Sarah standing there, her heart beating a little faster than before. And it was then she realized, for the first time in a very long time, her shoulders didn't feel quite so heavy anymore. In the days that followed, Libby lay under thick drifts of snow, rooftops heavy and white, cold spilling down from the mountains, seeping through every crack and crevice. The whole town moved slowly, quietly, with nothing but the distant sound of saws biting into timber and boots crunching on snow. Sarah soon settled into her new rhythm. At dawn, she joined Mrs. Webb in the kitchen to help with breakfast, sipping a mug of strong black coffee before retreating to the little room at the back of the house, where spools of thread and bolts of fabric lay waiting. Her needle moved steadily, each line of stitches straight and deliberate, like choices she'd never dared to make before. The door to her sewing room was hardly ever shut. People just kept coming. An elderly teacher with a frayed wool skirt, a young logger with a shirt torn clean through at the shoulder, a tired mother holding a baby in one arm and a pair of overalls in the other. They came, cautious at first, but slowly warming to her. They no longer looked at her as too much. Here, her hands had value. Every seam she mended seemed to stitch back together a little more of herself, and of the quiet respect she'd long been denied. And though the laughter from the saloon still carried faintly through town, it no longer reached deep enough to wound. On Friday evening before the church social, Mrs. Webb quietly appeared in the doorway with a folded velvet dress in her hands. Deep wine red with copper embroidery along the collar. "Try this," she said simply. "I don't wear it anymore. Suits you better than it ever did me." Standing before the mirror, Sarah smoothed the soft velvet and took a few tentative steps. In the candlelight, the woman looking back at her wasn't the one who'd stood alone on that muddy platform, or the one who'd flinched under the weight of every whisper. This woman stood tall, strong, unapologetically taking up space she'd always been told to shrink from. That night, Ethan didn't appear, just as she'd expected. But the next morning, he leaned against her sewing room doorway, arms loosely crossed. She glanced up and couldn't help but smile. "Mr. Blackwood," she greeted. "Miss Carpenter," he replied, his voice low and steady. "Business good?" "Busy," she said, nodding toward the neat stacks of mended clothes. "Busy means useful." He stepped further in and set a heavy canvas bag on her work table. "Here, from the boys. Coats, pants full of pitch, a few beyond saving. See what you can do." Sarah opened the bag, pulling out one battered jacket after another. Her amber eyes glinted with quiet determination. "I can save them all," she said firmly. Ethan watched her a moment, then the faintest smile tugged at his lips. Then, almost too soft for her to catch, he asked, "You'll be there Saturday night?" Sarah hesitated just a beat. "Will you?" Ethan dipped his head, slightly, that quiet, understated smile lingering. "Maybe," he murmured. "Maybe I will." He left unhurried, leaving behind the faint scent of pine resin, fabric dust, and the crisp chill of snow drifting in from the porch. That evening, as she stitched a cuff in the warm glow of the oil lamp, Sarah caught herself smiling, a smile she hadn't realized she still knew how to wear. And she thought, perhaps there was nothing warmer in this world than being seen for who you are, and having someone choose to stay. Saturday arrived with a sky so blue it looked scrubbed clean. The rare winter sunlight poured down on Libby's snow-covered rooftops, glinting across the town's main street. All day, townsfolk bustled about preparing for the church social. One of those rare nights when everyone came, if only to see and be seen. Long tables lined the hall, heavy with pies, the scent of roast chicken drifting out the open doors. From the dais, the sound of fiddles tuning up mixed with laughter and chatter. In her room at Mrs. Webb's, Sarah stood before the mirror, fingers smoothing the deep wine-red velvet dress, her hair pinned up neatly, a few soft curls left loose to frame her face. No corset, no stooping, just Sarah Lynn Carpenter, tall and proud, in a dress she'd sewn herself, standing exactly as she was meant to. When she walked into the hall, the murmur of conversation softened, heads turned, eyes followed her, half curious, half cautious, but this time she didn't lower her gaze. She'd spent too many years shrinking under those looks. Tonight, she let them stare. Some smiled politely, some whispered, some simply blinked in surprise, as if they'd never imagined a woman like her could walk in, unbowed and unashamed. Mrs. Webb swept in like a ship in full sail, whispering as she passed, "You look radiant. They're going to regret every word they've said behind your back." Sarah allowed herself a small laugh. "That's not the goal." "No," Mrs. Webb winked, "but it's a nice bonus." For nearly an hour, Sarah moved through the crowd under Mrs. Webb's deft guidance, shaking hands with the Reverend, greeting the schoolteacher, answering the post office widow's questions about her sewing. A petite logger's wife murmured, looking up at her, "You know, I've never been able to reach the top shelf in my kitchen. You're already a blessing to this town." Sarah smiled, soft and warm, and for a moment, it felt like enough. Then the music dimmed. Not entirely, just faded a little, because Ethan had stepped through the door. He stood tall and broad-shouldered, in a crisp white shirt that seemed just slightly out of place on him, his presence quiet but commanding, and his blue eyes found her instantly. He crossed the room slowly, steadily, and no one dared stop him. When he reached her, he gave a faint nod. "Miss Carpenter," his low voice rumbled, "you look, well." She answered, lightly, "So do you." Her voice dropped slightly. "I didn't think you'd come." Ethan's lips curved just barely. "I only said I might. I never said I wouldn't." They drifted to the edge of the floor, where candlelight flickered warmly on polished wood. The old Reverend passed by and nodded them toward the dancers. Ethan turned to her. Care to dance? Sarah drew a slow breath, feeling her hands tremble faintly. It's been a long time. Then we'll be rusty together. He offered his hand. She placed hers in his, and it fit somehow. They moved onto the floor, slow at first, finding the rhythm. She didn't have to look down. Their eyes were level, their steps even. In her chest, some long tightened knot began to ease. His hand at her back was firm, not possessive, guiding her like a partner, not a prize. You're staring, Ethan murmured. I'm not used to this, she admitted softly. Most men can't handle dancing with a woman taller than them. Ethan raised an eyebrow, his tone dry. Most men are fools. As the music slowed, they stepped aside, each taking a glass of warm cider. Sarah's gaze wandered toward the back pews, and froze. Robert Kinney was there, watching them, his eyes sharp, his lips twisted in something between a sneer and a smirk. Ethan followed her line of sight. Don't let him ruin this, he said lowly. I won't, Sarah replied. Not anymore. Robert made his way over, voice sickly sweet. Miss Carpenter, Blackwood, didn't expect to see the two of you here tonight. Ethan stood taller, his voice cool. We're like anyone else. Robert's smile tightened. Some might say, this isn't quite proper. Sarah set her glass down, meeting Robert's eyes, her voice calm but cutting. Let them say what they want. I've been talked about all my life. It doesn't change me. Robert faltered for a moment, then hissed, Libby has its traditions. And maybe, she cut in, her amber eyes unyielding. It's time those traditions changed. He stiffened. She held his gaze and added, her voice like steel. I'd rather have feet too big than a heart too small. His face reddened as he spun on his heel and stormed out, boots echoing sharply on the floorboards. Ethan exhaled, watching him go. You handled that better than I would have. Sarah turned to him, her eyes bright. You give me courage. Ethan's lips curved, quiet and genuine. You already had it. I just helped you see it. The social ended late, but Libby's main street still glowed with warm light, snow falling gently to blanket rooftops and wooden steps. Sarah and Ethan walked side by side, their breath mingling in faint clouds in the icy air. They moved slowly toward Webb's boarding house, the street now quiet and still, broken only by the soft crunch of snow underfoot and the creak of old shop signs swaying in the wind. At the gate, Ethan stopped, his hand tightening slightly at his side. Thank you for dancing with me, he said softly, his voice low and warm, like the steady sound of timber being cut, rough yet resonant. Sarah turned toward him, her amber eyes catching the glow of the street lamp. Thank you for showing up, she replied. That meant more than you know. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. In his blue eyes then, there was something like quiet reverence. He tilted his head slightly, a faint, wry smile playing at his lips. You're remarkable, Sarah Carpenter. Before she could answer, he tipped his hat and turned, his tall frame fading into the quiet, leaving only the sound of his steady footsteps growing softer in the snow. Sarah stood still at the gate, her fingers brushing the spot on her shoulder where his hand had rested as they danced, then pushed the gate open and stepped inside, her heart somehow lighter than before. The next morning, snow fell even heavier, pale sunlight slanting cold through her window. Sarah rose early, straightened her sewing table, ready for the day. But just as she reached for her needle, a frantic knock echoed from the front hall. Mrs. Webb opened the door, and a young logger's breathless voice followed. Miss Carpenter, is she here? It's Mr. Blackwood. He's been hurt. Sarah's heart thudded hard, her needle slipping from her fingers. She rushed to the door. Where is he? The doctor's house, the young man panted. We couldn't bring him farther. The snow? He's alive, but... She didn't wait to hear more. She grabbed her coat, skirts brushing through the deepening snow as she ran, wind biting her cheeks, breath hot in her throat. Dr. Phillips' house glowed warm in the winter dusk, the air inside thick with antiseptic and smoke. Loggers huddled near the fireplace, their faces pale, shirts still stained with pine sap and blood. A nurse appeared at Sarah's side, laying a gentle hand on her shoulder, her voice quiet. "He's waiting for you, but just a moment. He's weak." Sarah nodded and stepped into the back room. Ethan lay there, his big frame too large for the narrow cot, white bandages wrapped tight around his chest and head, his right leg splinted and elevated, blood seeping faintly through the wrappings at his knee. But his blue eyes, still calm, still steady, found hers immediately. He managed a faint, weary smile. "You came," he rasped. Sarah sank into the chair by his bedside, taking his broad, calloused hand in hers, her voice trembling but firm. "Of course I came. I'll come. Every day until you're back on your feet." Ethan's eyes fluttered shut, his lips curving in a tired but warm smile. "Don't worry," he murmured. "Just hate lying still is all. I'll be fine." Sarah brushed his hair back gently, leaning close to whisper, "You will be fine. I'll make sure of it." Outside, snow continued to fall, thick and quiet. But in that small room, warmth spread between their clasped hands. And in that moment, Sarah realized, love wasn't some distant promise or grand declaration. It was something quiet, something simple, when one person chose to stay beside another, no matter what. In the days that followed, Libby lay buried under snow so heavy it seemed the whole town might disappear beneath it. White blanketed every rooftop, every path, every silent line of pine trees, standing like sentinels in the stillness. Ethan was moved from Dr. Phillips' house to Webb's boarding house, just as the doctor recommended. He was past the worst, but still needed rest. No stairs, no harsh cold, and someone to watch over him. Sarah prepared everything. Mrs. Webb converted the parlor into a proper sick room, laying out thick wool blankets and setting a small stove in the corner. When two loggers carried Ethan in, Sarah was already waiting, hands gripping the hem of her coat, her amber eyes calm, hiding every trace of worry. They set him gently on the bed, and he groaned as his legs shifted. But when he opened his eyes and saw her there, a faint, tired smile broke across his face. "Looks like I can't seem to get far from you," he joked, his voice still hoarse. Sarah bent to straighten the blanket. "And just where do you think you're going?" she murmured, half chastising, half gentle. In those first days, Ethan barely moved, sometimes wincing at the pain, sometimes closing his eyes in silence. Sarah stayed by him nearly all day, stitching by the window, tidying the room, brewing ginger tea, or simply sitting quietly, her hand resting over his as if to say, "I'm here." The town began to whisper. First came the glances in the general store, then the soft pointed questions at church. A bakery owner sighed to no one in particular. Strange, a single girl like that, fussing over an unmarried man. Mrs. Webb overheard and simply snorted, slicing carrots with a sharp snap. "People just don't know what to do with a woman who dares live outside their expectations," she muttered. Sarah said nothing. She was used to whispers. She had endured them all her life. But now, they felt like little more than gusts of wind, unable to reach her core. Only Robert Kinney was different. Lately, he no longer hid the smug curl of his lip whenever he passed her on the street. Once, tipping his hat as she walked by, he sneered, "Some folks just can't help but make a spectacle of themselves." Sarah stopped, looked him dead in the eye, her gaze like fire, and then turned away without a word. He wasn't worth it. Inside that small parlor, peace remained. Ethan slowly regained his strength, his smile steadied, his voice grew clearer, and his old steady resolve returned to his eyes. On quiet afternoons, Sarah would set aside her sewing, and they'd play cards. When she won, he would groan dramatically, "You're not bluffing me, are you?" Sarah only arched an eyebrow, lips quirking. "I've spent my whole life pretending I wasn't hurt. You think I can't fake a flush?" They laughed, light and unguarded, filling the room with a kind of warmth that even the howling wind outside couldn't touch. But that night, when the sky outside turned coal black and snow fell thicker than ever, came a sharp knock at the door. Mrs. Webb answered it. Robert Kinney stood on the porch, coat immaculate, face tight, but smiling his same false smile. "I've come to speak with Mr. Blackwood," he said smoothly. Mrs. Webb crossed her arms, her gaze cool. "About what?" "Town business, serious business." "Then say it here." Robert stepped inside, his sharp eyes scanning the room until they landed on Sarah, sitting at Ethan's bedside. His smile widened just slightly. "Well," he drawled, "isn't this cozy?" Ethan shifted upright, his voice clipped. "Say what you came to say. Don't circle it." Robert set his hat down, his tone dropping. "The vote on the railroad is in 4 days. You've missed every meeting. Everyone's saying you've lost your say." Ethan met his stare, his eyes like steel. "I'll be there." Robert tilted his head, his gaze flicking to Sarah, then back to Ethan. "Oh, I'm sure you will. Seems you found your motivation," he added with a smug little glance. Sarah rose, tall and unflinching, her voice icy. "Careful, Mr. Kinney. You're mistaking kindness for weakness again." Robert froze for a beat, his mouth pressing into a tight line, then turned sharply and slammed the door behind him. Ethan leaned back against the pillows, letting out a long breath. "He's going to try something," he murmured. Sarah laid her hand on his shoulder, her voice steady and strong. "Then we'll be ready." And just then, he opened his eyes and really looked at her, long and hard, and for the first time she saw it. He didn't need to ask if she was afraid, because he already knew the answer. Number. Not anymore. The snow kept falling for the next 3 days, thick and heavy, as though it meant to bury the whole town of Libby under a silent white shroud. But inside the little parlor of Webb's boarding house, warmth lingered, in the stove, in the smell of tea, and in the steady way Sarah watched Ethan take his first steps again. He could now stand with his crutch, take slow, halting circles of the room. His face still tightened with pain at times, but his blue eyes no longer held hesitation. Each morning, Sarah stood behind him, her hands ready, but never quite touching, letting him find his balance and smiling when he looked back at her. Word of Ethan's intent to appear at the council vote had already spread through Libby. In the stores, in the church, on street corners, people whispered, some scoffing, some surprised, some quietly hoping he'd prevail. Robert Kinney didn't bother hiding his smirk. To him, the idea of Ethan limping into the town hall was laughable and easy to crush. On Thursday morning, the day of the vote, Sarah rose before dawn. She laid out Ethan's heavy coat, wrapped his scarf herself, and fastened each button with care. Then she rested her hand on his arm and looked into his eyes. "You're going to win," she said firmly, no quaver in her voice. Ethan gave a faint, rare grin, almost teasing. "And if I don't?" She tilted her head. What could be more important? He leaned just close enough to murmur, "You." The town hall was packed to bursting. People crammed the steps outside, muttering and jostling for space. Inside, the air was thick with tension, voices buzzing like hornets. Robert Kinney stood at the front, hand resting on a large map of the proposed railroad, wearing his polished smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," he drawled, "this line will bring money, jobs, a brighter future. Those who oppose it have never really understood this town." The room hummed with murmured agreement and scattered nods. Then the doors opened. Every head turned. Ethan Blackwood appeared, tall despite his limp, crutch under his arm. Beside him walked Sarah, her dark red coat standing out boldly, her expression steady, as though she owned the room. They made their way to the front, and Ethan sat in the first row. He looked up, his blue gaze sweeping the room, and gradually the noise died. He planted both hands on his crutch, his voice low but resonant. "You all know me. You've seen me shoulder timber, pull men from wrecks, fight fires, bury friends. I don't speak fancy, but I know this land, and I know when it's being sold off too cheap." He gestured to the map, his tone cutting through the silence. "They'll take the trees, level the ridge, and when they leave, what will be left for us?" The room fell quiet enough to hear the wind whistling through the windows. Then Sarah stood, taller than anyone else in the room, her amber eyes burning with resolve. "I came here a stranger," she began clearly. I was left on the platform before I even unpacked my suitcase. But I stayed, because some things are worth standing tall for. This town doesn't need quick money. It needs vision, endurance, self-respect. This man has bled for this place, understands what balance means. If you turn away from that, you're not just cutting down trees. You're cutting down the spine of this town. Silence. Then whispers. Then a few nods. A faint ripple of applause. Robert stepped forward, his smile brittle, voice cold. Let's not forget, the ones against this plan aren't even from Libby. They don't understand our history. Ethan's hand tightened on his crutch. He sat taller, his eyes sharp as steel. You're right, he said. I wasn't born here, but I stayed through 10 winters, 10 summers, 10 years of building something real. What have you done, besides plan how to sell it out? The gavel struck hard on the podium. That's enough. Time to vote. The council filed into the side room. The chamber filled with low, urgent chatter. Sarah gripped Ethan's shoulder, her heart hammering. At last, the judge returned, voice firm and clear. 3-2. The council rejects the northern route. The southern route will proceed. The room erupted. Cheers, relief, applause. Some stood and clapped, others simply exhaled deeply. Ethan closed his eyes, his breath slow, his shoulders easing as though a great weight had been lifted. Sarah squeezed his arm, whispering close, "We did it." But in both their eyes they knew. Today's victory was not just for the forest, but for themselves, and the worth they'd fought so long to prove. Over the following week, the snow began to melt, slowly. The wooden rooftops along Libby's main street showed patches of dull gray beneath the white, droplets falling steadily from the eaves into soft, muddy puddles. The air was still damp and cold, but there was a faint hint of warmth in the winter sun. Ethan was now allowed to leave his bed, practicing longer walks around the house. He still leaned on his crutch, still moved carefully, but there was a quiet smile on his lips, a smile Sarah had come to recognize as being just for her. He didn't move back to his own home right away. Mrs. Webb only nodded approvingly when he decided to stay and heal a little longer, without a word of protest. Sarah didn't question it either. She simply laid out fresh linens, replaced the water in the little vase on the table, and kept the kettle warm every afternoon. The first day, Ethan managed to walk to the back porch. Sarah walked beside him, not holding him up, just matching his slow steps. They stopped before the pines at the edge of the yard, where the snow had melted enough to reveal patches of dark, damp earth and the faintest green shoots pushing through. Ethan leaned on the railing, gazing into the distance, and murmured, "They'll keep talking, you know." Sarah tilted her head, her amber eyes calm and unwavering. "Let them talk." He looked at her for a long time, his eyes memorizing every line of her face in the pale afternoon light. Then, slowly, he smiled. "Yes, let them talk." The gossip spread quickly, as it always did in a town this small. But this time, the looks directed at Sarah were no longer so sharp. Women began visiting her more often, bringing her fabrics, placing spring orders. An old widow asked her to repair a wedding dress. A logger's wife dropped a sack of flour on her table, murmuring shyly, "You don't know. The kids at home talk about you all the time. Say, you're so brave." Sarah only smiled, saying nothing, but felt a strange warmth bloom in her chest. Children ran past the boarding house, waving. "Hi, Miss Sarah." "Hi, Mr. Ethan." Ethan, standing on the porch with his crutch, watched the children laugh and turned to her, teasing, "You've become one of them now." Sarah arched an eyebrow, the corner of her lips curving slightly. "And you?" Ethan squinted, his voice dropping low. "I have been for a long time." That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Sarah sat alone in the sewing room, a small oil lamp flickering beside her. On the table lay a bolt of new velvet Mrs. Webb had asked her to cut for a spring dress. She placed her hand over the soft fabric, tracing the folds, then stopped, her gaze drifting to the dark window. In the glass, she saw her reflection, a tall, strong woman, her eyes alight, no longer shrinking to fit what others expected. And Sarah realized She hadn't just found a man who could look her in the eye without flinching. She'd found herself, once more, and for good. Here in Libby, Montana, through a long, cold winter, she'd stood tall and stayed. And for the first time, she truly felt she belonged. Outside the window, snow still drifted down in soft flakes, the moonlight silvering the quiet street. And in that stillness, Sarah smiled, rose slowly, blew out the lamp, and murmured softly, "Let them talk." Spring came earlier than expected. The last of the snow melted away, revealing muddy paths winding through Libby, and soft green shoots pushing up between the dark pines. Sarah was no longer a stranger here. People called her the town seamstress now, greeting her by name at the market, smiling when they caught her gaze. And she no longer looked down at her feet when they did. Ethan no longer used his crutch. He still limped a little, but he stood as tall and steady as the old trees in the woods. He'd returned to the logging camp, but every evening he came back to the boarding house, as though that place and the woman waiting for him on the porch were where he truly belonged. One late afternoon after work, Ethan appeared at the back porch, where Sarah was hanging fresh curtains she'd just sewn. The spring sunlight slanted through the pines, gilding her hair as he stood still for a moment, simply watching her. She turned, saw him, and smiled softly. "You're looking at me like that again." Ethan cleared his throat, his smile faintly shy. "Yeah, I was just wondering if you know how beautiful you are." Sarah raised an eyebrow, turning away to hide a quiet smile. "Still saying sweet things, just to catch me off guard." He stepped closer, standing beside her, his voice lower, more earnest than ever. "Number. It's the truth." Slowly he pulled a small wooden box from his pocket and set it down on her sewing table. Sarah looked at him, her amber eyes questioning. "What's this?" Ethan met her gaze, his tone steady, though his hand trembled slightly. "It's the reason I don't want to go anywhere else anymore." She opened the box. Inside was a slender silver ring, set with a green stone as bright and deep as his eyes. The room went quiet, her heart beat loud in her ears. Ethan took her hand, his rough, calloused fingers closing gently around hers. His blue eyes held hers as he spoke, his voice catching just a little. "You don't need to change. You don't need to stoop or be smaller or fit some mold. Just keep standing tall. Keep being you. And stay here, please." Sarah looked at him, her amber eyes shimmering in the fading golden light. And in that moment, all the years she'd spent shrinking to fit someone else's expectations seemed to melt away, like snow under the sun. She placed her other hand over his, squeezing softly, and smiled, bright and sure. "All right, I'll stay." That summer, Libby bloomed with life. The old forest stood untouched, trains rumbled through the new southern route, and people still told stories about the tall seamstress and the logger who stood up for the town. But eventually, the gossip faded, because in the end, they were no longer just the ones who didn't fit. They'd become part of the place itself. One quiet sunset on the back porch of Webb's boarding house, Sarah leaned her shoulder against Ethan's, her eyes on the endless stretch of forest glowing gold in the last light. She closed her eyes and whispered, like a promise, "Let them talk. We'll keep standing, just as we are." Outside, the breeze carried the scent of a new season, rustling through the little town like a quiet hymn, of a woman who learned to stand tall, of a man who found where he belonged, and of love, sometimes nothing more, and nothing less than choosing each other, no matter what.